Hello and welcome to today's webinar, The Human Stress Response. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to briefly go over a couple of housekeeping items. If you'd like to ask a question during the presentation, just use the chat feature which is found on the right side of your screen. And if you'd like to earn 1 CU, just be sure to stick around to the very end. We will have a code that's given out and you'll need to email me that. And if you're watching with the group, just each person has to email me individually. And if you happen to be viewing this at a later date, we only give CUs out during live webinars. So we are hoping to record this and we'll upload it to our YouTube channel at a later time. And if you're new to us and would like to know more about trainings like this, we do have a Facebook page. Be sure to check us out. We post things such as our monthly webinars there and other happenings around the state of Arkansas and just things in general regarding to childhood trauma. So Dr. Terry Combs-Orm is our speaker for today. She's a leader in the field of early childhood development. Dr. Combs-Orm is a professor at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville in the College of Social Work. And she's also an endowed professor at the Urban Child Institute. I actually first met Dr. Combs-Orm while in graduate school, and I can tell you that not only is she extremely knowledgeable about early childhood development and how our body responds to stress, but that she's also a terrific teacher. So please give a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Terry Combs-Orm.
Hello. This is a new thing for me, speaking behind PowerPoints without being on camera, but I must say I like it. So far this is fun. I'm looking here to see how I should be able to advance the slide, but I'm not seeing the arrow. Okay. All right, let me begin by acknowledging and thanking the Urban Child Institute in Memphis, Tennessee. They endowed a professorship for me, and they are the group in Memphis who are working to promote healthy brain development and have a lot of resources if you're interested on their website, theurbanchildinstitute.com. Okay, so Chad, I don't see. There it is. Okay. So what is stress? I think we all talk about stress, and if you're a social worker, you probably are aware that you feel stressed a fair amount of the time. But stress is not a feeling. Stress is your body's physiological process for coping with challenge or threat. Human beings are not the biggest species on Earth, though we may be the meanest, I think. And so this is a physiological system that's evolved and enabled us to survive as a species all this time by promoting survival when we're under threat. So let's begin with what happens or what's going on before you perceive a threat. So our body likes to be in homeostasis. We really like to be in a narrow range with regard to heartbeat and body temperature and respiratory rate, all of this kind of stuff. And if we get too hot or too cold, the body immediately wants to try to get us back to where we belong. We function much better in homeostasis. But how are we able to return to homeostasis when something goes wrong and we fall out of it? It's called allostasis. This is really just your body's way of going back to stability by changing something. So when you're really cold, you will shiver. When you're really hot, you'll sweat. And these are physiological processes to help you get back to where your body wants to be. But it didn't flee. So shivering or sweating costs you something, as do other methods of allostasis. Now, it may just be a few calories burned, When you shiver, it burns a few extra calories. Therefore, somebody recently came up with a great idea for a diet where you turn your thermostat down to 50 and live with that all day. It's supposed to make you lose weight. But other than just calories burned, there can also be serious organ damage. And it depends upon how often and how intensely your body has to return you to homeostasis. We call the cost to your body allostatic load. So generally, it's not harmful. But when your body is using so many resources to try to get back to homeostasis that you exceed what you have available in terms of calories or anything else, your body goes into allostatic overload. And this happens when you are under such extreme stress for so long that the constant flow of cortisol, which we're going to talk about in a moment, is pretty much ignored by the body because it does not have any more resources to deal with this. Think of it as a constant fight or flight condition. And your body just quits reacting to cortisol, which is very harmful because cortisol is that lagging hormone that tells your body that the event is over, we can relax. Here's what happens to you when you perceive a threat in your environment. Your body needs to be able to get out of there or to fight or in some way to defend yourself. The threat is first perceived by your hypothalamus. Now, this is the part of your brain that integrates all of your sensory information. And this info lands in your hypothalamus before it lands in your frontal cortex right here. So what happens is maybe the hypothalamus hears a noise and perceives something moving out of the corner of your eye. This causes the release of cortico-releasing hormone factors, which basically just tell your pituitary gland things are in trouble, we've got to react. And it sends out these chemicals. And your adrenal glands realize something's going on and they pump out adrenaline. Now what does adrenaline do? It's right here on the left. It mobilizes your energy and increases it to the point that you can get out of there. This is what is happening when you hear occasionally about a young mother moving a car off her toddler. She's not really strong enough to do that, but the alarm she feels, the perception that her toddler is going to die, causes her heart to speed up, the tone of her heart to be more regular. It suppresses digestion and growth hormones. Don't need those right now to survive. It suppresses reproduction. Don't need to ovulate. We might be toast. We better get out of here. It suppresses your immune system. And all of the information or all of this energy that would go to these other processes goes to fight or flight. So the other thing that's going on here is that two parts of your nervous system, of your brain, are working to help you survive this nasty threat. If you'll notice on the right, the sympathetic nervous system is kicked in, and it does all of these things you see because you need a faster heart, you need to be able to breathe more quickly. You don't need peristalsis. There are a lot of things you don't need. You don't need to go to the bathroom. But it gets the adrenaline going and it converts glycogen to glucose. Glucose is the blood sugar that enables you to run or to fight. When all of the danger is past, and your body knows this because you secrete cortisol, this kicks in a feedback loop, and it kicks the parasympathetic system back in. And you can see what happens with all of this. You basically go back to homeostasis. So all of this happens generally before you've even had time to think, whoa, I'm in trouble here. Because if you needed it to go to your frontal cortex, the thinking part of your brain, if you needed to make a plan, you'd probably be toast by then. You don't have time to think about it. So let me just emphasize again, you often hear cortisol talked about as the stress hormone. Cortisol is a lagging hormone, as you see here on the yellow line. Adrenaline kicks in immediately to give you that energy you need. And as the event proceeds, cortisol comes in at a later date. And your cortisol level will remain elevated for a while after the event has happened. And then it will go back down. So, although it sounds really scary, stress is very adaptive. It enables you potentially to get out of situations that are atypical and threatening and scary. But the whole thing is designed to be shut down by that feedback loop when cortisol kicked in. How your feedback loop can get broken such that your body is no longer able to respond to cortisol by shutting down. One of the problems for us in modern life is that stress has become a little bit different than it used to be. So we evolved to escape this kind of stress. Now, I'm not thinking he really has a chance, but he thinks he does. And his adrenaline has kicked in and he's running. So this is real stress. This is an actual threat to your survival. This is not. But this is the kind of stress we have every day in our lives. Psychological stressors that mimic an actual threat to our existence. You pass your boss in the hall and she has kind of a funny look on her face and you suddenly think, I'm going to be fired. I've not been performing up to par. I'm a mess. I'm going to be out of a job. I'll be poor. My kids will starve. And it takes off in your head and you get the same reaction in your body as you would get running from that bear. This is not adaptive, primarily because of what we talked about in a moment. So if you're under chronic stress, that momentary change in your heart rate and your blood pressure and your immune system and all of those other systems becomes chronic. And the result is a whole set of chronic diseases that are kind of the hallmark of our times. Infertility, because your reproductive system is not operating because it's suppressed. You're under great stress. Obesity and diabetes, because this pouring of hormones messes up your metabolism and your ability to process glucose. Lots of digestive problems, including constipation, because your body is not into digesting your food. It's into survival. So you can see this list is pretty much consistent with kinds of chronic diseases that are a major part of our healthcare system now. So how do you cope with it? There are several ways we cope that are not so good. There are other ways we could cope in ways that are positive, and there's very good research evidence that these things are effective. So when you're under a lot of stress, let's say you're having serious financial problems and you're waking up during the middle of the night, your heart is beating fast, you've got all of those symptoms we talked about because you're in a constant state of adaptation and survival. Generally, we can cope in two broad ways with our problems. We can focus on the problem and ruminate on the details. So go back to our office and think about the look on the boss's face. Was it that last case? Was it when I disagreed with her in the staff meeting? You can sit and do that all afternoon. Or you can focus on yourself and your response to the stressor and change or control your responses. And this is where yoga and meditation and deep breathing come in. And there is pretty significant research evidence that these kinds of acts and interventions really do help with the physiological damage that comes from stress, constant stress. So what is going on? I don't know why I did that. What is going on when you're under a lot of stress? What is happening to your brain? This is very important because most of your clients, and particularly if they've been exposed to trauma, are experiencing stress very constantly. Very few people come in to see us who are not under stress and suffering the physiological effects of it. And this includes children. We're going to talk in a minute about how stress in early life actually damages your brain development and can have lifelong effects. So several things will determine how your brain reacts. First of all, genetics. There are some versions of different genes, those are called alleles, that make it easier or harder for you to adapt to stress. You're just stuck with that. You're born with that. But it's not your fate necessarily, because epigenetics, that is the effects of previous experiences, also can help or hurt your ability to respond to stress. So if you experience a hugely threatening, terrible event in young adulthood, but you've lived a pretty good life, you're in decent health, you were nurtured and loved by your parents, you have good social support now, these experiences have helped your body, your genes, express in ways that are adaptive and will help you in times of stress. There are also some personal resources that can help you. Intelligence is very helpful in adapting to stress. Problem-solving abilities, and maybe those two things are the same thing. But the main point is that if you're able to reason about what's happening and come up with alternatives, then you may be able to respond to stress better. Social support. We have always known in social work that more social support results in better mental health, physical health, everything. And there are reasons for that that have to do with hormones that we'll talk about a little more in a moment. And finally, the healthier you are when something like this happens to you, the more likely you are to deal adaptively with it. Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm under a lot of stress, I don't tend to go eat broccoli and go out for a run to deal with my stress. those are things I ought to do. But stress itself tends to make you goof off, eat bad things, and become sedentary. So again, about the genetics. So there is one gene, it's called 5-HT actually. And if you've got a short allele, there are two alleles, a short one and a long one. If you've got the long allele and you experience great adversity, generally you will adapt just fine. That was discovered with maltreated children. They were wondering, researchers were wondering why the same abused children who experienced very similar things came out so different. And one thing is that this gene, this allele, makes you more susceptible under adversity. If there's no adversity, you probably won't see effects. There are other genes, and we don't even know what they are. We've got about 21,000 genes, and there are probably multiple genes involved in everything. So some of those are also involved. The 5-HT gene is a serotonin receptor gene, and it is key because serotonin is a huge part of our hormone system in terms of depression and obsessive compulsive disorder and all kinds of mental variables. Finally, your temperament is to some degree totally genetic. You are either a person who reacts very strongly to any kind of event and have a little trouble calming down afterward, or some people do not react strongly, and this is a physiological tendency. You can smooth off edges here, but if you've ever noticed, for instance, with babies, they've generally got a pretty identifiable temperament, and you can help them, but you're not going to make someone who's very reactive and jumpy a totally calm person. So epigenetics is huge. We talked earlier about the stress response system involving the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the adrenal glands. Your system for responding to stress develops during gestation. It starts developing in the womb, and it responds to your mother's hormone levels because you share a blood supply. If she is beaten up and experiences a huge amount of stress response, that hormone bath goes to the baby as well. That system finishes developing in early life, about the first 3 months or so, which is often called the 4th trimester, because the brain doesn't finish developing until about 3 months. The second thing that's important is early life experiences. And we're going to talk in a moment about what kinds of experiences, but the general rule is the more adversity and stress a child suffers from in life, the less functional their responses to stress will be in the future. Probably the most important early life experiences have to do with nurturing and soothing. Particularly in the first 3 months of life, your brain expects for people to stroke you and kiss to you and sing to you and talk in a funny high voice to you. Your brain expects this. And I'll show you in just a minute why this is so important. Dr. Michael Meany at McGill University has been doing a lot of research with mice over the years. It may not be a compliment, but honestly, we're a lot like mice. We share about 98% of our genes with mice. We are subject to many of the same diseases and illnesses. And so Meany wondered whether nurturing and soothing and loving is as significant with early development in mice as it is with humans. And the way he looked at this is he looked at thousands of mouse mothers and their babies over the course of the years. And he discovered that there is, much as there is in humans, there's fairly normal distribution of the quality of parenting. Well, how do we judge that in mice? Good mouse mothers, way up here, are sucker mouse mothers, kiss by licking, and they groom their babies all the time. And very importantly, they arch their backs, as you can see here. So all of the babies have access to breastfeed. Now, you might think, I think I used to, that mouse parenting is, it's not variable like human beings. Well, Meany discovered that it is variable. So down here were the moms who never licked their babies, pretty much ignored them, didn't groom them, stepped all over them, neglected them, didn't make sure everybody got breastfed. Their pups tended to die of starvation if they were small and weak. And Meany's question was, okay, so we have this variation. How do the offspring turn out? And can we learn anything about humans in this way? Here's what he reasoned. The mothers, and he looked at a lot of things with these mouse mothers and discovered that the mothers who were the good moms tended to have low levels of stress. And babies were being told the world is a safe place. A mother who's very stressed, as we talked about earlier, communicates that the world is a really scary place. But then what happens after birth? He watched their parenting and realized that babies are born with this baseline stress reactivity that they develop during pregnancy. And they tortured some poor mouse mommies during pregnancy, exposing them to very high levels of stress, and discovered that their mothering later on wasn't as good, and their babies were born very stress reactive. But you've got that first 3 months of life when that HPA axis is continuing to develop. Now, this is because we were really born 3 months too early. If we were going to be born when we are mature and ready for the world, we'd stay in there about a year. The problem is our brains get too big and we can't get out if we stay that long. So the brain goes through its final development in what they call the 4th trimester. And in mice, what happens that is healthy is this kind of behavior that corresponds to this kind of behavior in humans. Now, Meany tested a lot of ways how this happened. He did not just observe the mice at birth. He also looked at how things went later. And what they discovered was a difference in the brains of the babies who were licked and groomed a lot. And basically, the mice babies who were nurtured had higher levels of glucoid receptors in their hippocampi. Now, I don't know how much you've read about the brain, so let me just emphasize real quickly. The hippocampus is the part of the brain associated with learning and memory. It receives stress hormones, and the more receptors on the hippocampus to soak up those hormones, the healthier your response to stress is. And what they found was that the more moms licked and groomed their little babies, the more receptors they had in their hippocampi. Well, this was major because they also discovered that those mice who had been groomed more and had more glucose receptors in their hippocampi. Okay, here's just a picture. I'm sorry, I can't see what the next slide is here. This is just an emphasis to show you that these receptors take up these hormones as they enter the synaptic cleft in the brain. And none of these terms is very important. What's important is you would like to have more receptors so that you would handle stressful cues in your brain more healthily. In other words, you would respond less extremely and you would recover more quickly. Well, guess what? This is what early life nurturing does for you. They further discovered that those little offspring, in addition to having more receptors, and these are high licking and grooming, had lower levels of stress hormones across the board. Now, this is not because they never experienced stress, because they were exposed to stress. It's because their brains responded more modestly and recovered more quickly when they were exposed to stress. So we can't go around exposing babies and fetuses to high levels of stress. So Meany and his team and other researchers have looked for ways to extend this research to human beings. One of the very simple ways they did this was to take people who had varying levels of trait anxiety meaning it's sort of constant level, not in the face of some individual event. And they discovered that people who reported better care by their parents in childhood had lower levels of anxiety consistently. So this is pretty crude. There could be other explanations for this. So they continued to pursue this to try to figure out what's going on. And Meany and some other researchers had, now one of our issues here when we talk about this with human brains is that we cannot look at living brain tissue to see how many receptors are in the hippocampus. But they took a tissue bank, a suicide tissue bank, where brains of people who've died from other things and brains of people who have died from suicide are stored so they can be analyzed as we learn more about how to do that. And they discovered that there were, okay, so in all cases, controls had higher levels of receptors. These are people who died of other things. Because they had very thorough records about these suicide victims, they knew which had been abused and which had not. Higher levels of receptors in these people who were not abused and lower levels in people who were abused on both of these different types of cells. Okay, so we're getting closer to showing that human beings respond in similar ways to early life nurturing and loving, and then how they respond to stress later in life. Finally, and if you work in child welfare, this won't surprise you, the mice who were nurtured well also nurtured their own babies well. And this followed down the generations. Well, now you might say, well, big surprise. We know that parenting runs in families. maybe it's just genetic. Well, Meany was aware of that possibility, so he cross-fostered, basically, to see if he took mothers away from the good, calm mothers right at birth and put them with the abusive, neglectful mothers and vice versa. He thought he would be able to tell, is it the genetic component or is it nurturing and care in early life? Well, it's nurturing and care in early life. And it has to do with gene expression that gives you more glucocorticoid receptors when you are nurtured better. This makes your response to stress more sensitive to feedback and results in differences in stress reactivity. I think we've known as people who work with children and stressed and traumatized individuals for a long time that parenting makes a huge difference. But until Meany's research, we did not understand that there is a purely physiological basis to this. I was particularly excited to read about the cross-fostering because my practice experience was in foster care. And what this tells me is if you bring a baby into care at birth, for example, we have a terrible problem here in East Tennessee with opioid addiction during pregnancy. And very frequently here, over 600 times a year, babies are born addicted to opioids. And if you put those babies in good foster care situations where they get lots of love and affection, or if even you can work with mom to do that, to provide that affection and love, you've got that first 3 months to repair some of the problems that baby's going to have with stress reactivity. So this is just super exciting to me to think about the fact that we have an intervention that can make a difference in brain development. So let's think about this in relationship to your practice, and if you want to make a comment here, be sure to let Chad know. I have had trouble thinking of many situations where we get clients who do not come with high levels of physiological stress. You may not observe stressful circumstances in the present, but remember, those are stressors. Stress is a physiological process that is associated with all kinds of bad physical and mental health problems. For many of our clients, and particularly if you think about those who are poor, their stress began during gestation. Now, as those of you who've had children know, rarely does the stress you have during pregnancy get relieved when the newborn comes home with you. So very frequently, the early caregiving just exacerbates those prenatal effects on the infant's brain. Moreover, all kinds of adverse events seem to seek out the poor. And we understand now that these kinds of events just further perturb our ability to respond in a healthy way to stress. Now I want to emphasize it's not impossible to recover a healthy response to stress. It just gets harder and harder as you get older. Bruce Perry, the doctor who works frequently with severely abused children and has looked at the brain effects, says to remember this: when you are an adult and you have a terribly stressful event, and I use Hurricane Katrina as an example in my class, you may develop a symptom You may develop high levels of anxiety. You may develop a tic. You may develop depression. But if those things happen to you when your brain is still developing rapidly, your brain will organize around those events and that stress to try to adapt to it. And it will have very serious effects on the brain that get harder and harder to reverse as you get older. So the bottom line here for me is that poverty as well as racism stress out so many of our clients. When you don't have enough glucocorticoid receptors in your brain, and this is determined during your gestation and your early life by poor nurturing or lack of nurturing and high levels of adversity. And there can be no higher level of adversity than poverty and discrimination. That constant allostatic load of your body trying to respond to these things results in your human stress response becoming dysfunctional because it cannot respond to cortisol anymore. Bruce Perry also emphasizes in his work on the childtraumaacademy.org, you should look at that if you're interested in this, that when we try to do therapy with people who've been traumatized or are seriously stressed, when we try to do psychotherapy, we are addressing the highest level of their brain, the level of the brain that engages in reasoning and rationality. And we are probably trying to tell people, you're safe now, things are better, here's what you can do, when in reality, that adversity, that stress in their body is probably farther down in the brainstem, the earliest part of the brain to develop. The brain develops from the bottom up. And the earlier you have high levels of stress, the lower in your brain those things, those traumas exist. And if your problem is in your brainstem, if your brain is automatically responding because it's producing high levels of stress hormones, then your prefrontal cortex is not operating. It is just not ready for psychotherapy. We need to work lower. Now, these are the things that many of you practice with. We may not even, the purpose of the agency might not be that, but given a recent study that shows that 40% of Americans at least have experienced various adverse events very early in life, these are the things that our clients are dealing with. They have real physiological effects on their brains, and if we're going to help them, we have to access those effects where they are, rather than with the techniques and skills that are our favorites. Think about poverty. So half of all children grow up in poverty right now. Poverty is generally intergenerational. It's not just lack of resources. It's lack of security. It's a constant feeling of threat. It's crowded and violent housing, living in concrete instead of grass. Research shows that being in nature is healthier for the brain. It results in lower levels of the stress hormones. Poor schools, poor access to health care. These are all perceived by your brain as a threat because they are threats. They threaten your survival and they threaten your health. I like to emphasize as well, however, that racism still lives. Racism is still very healthy in our country. We're only about 3 generations removed from slavery. And if you attended Dr. Lethman's webinar about epigenetics, you know that slavery and the subsequent and all kinds of discrimination have probably caused epigenetic effects in the descendants of people who were enslaved. You know that if you've read anything about kindling, that the longer you're exposed to even what we call minimal or small slights, the kinds of slights African Americans experience when they go in the store and get followed around by the clerks who act like they're going to steal something, you know that those kinds of things result in a slightly elevated blood pressure. You know that over time it takes less and less insult to result in this stress effect. And finally, we understand better now that the allostatic load borne by African American and other minority women probably is responsible for much of the higher risk of low birth weight, premature birth, and infant mortality. Everything else can be controlled out, and there is this effect left that is believed to be the result of racism and discrimination. I already talked about this, but it basically has to do with the fact that even though the laws changed, African Americans experience this. It's called mundane because it's so typical, it's so, some people call it microaggression, but it's every day, it's constant, and has been going on for many generations. So there's every reason to think that this kind of stress has physiological effects and may be responsible, probably is responsible for much of the higher illness burden borne by African Americans in our country. And of course, this is all compounded by institutional racism. We can say the laws changed. We can say that things are better, and they are. But particularly these days, I worry that we're starting to go backwards again. So as social workers, we need to be aware not just of individual interventions, but of policy and program interventions that can reduce this kind of stress on a large portion of our population. And we need to be aware that we are wasting talent and resources when we don't take steps to reduce the stress. And this is just repetitive, just basically showing you that you can look at these results in the physical health as well as the mental health of populations. And it just makes perfect sense, since we've been unable to explain it with other kinds of variables, that the stress is part of that. You can't control that out. And this is kindling. I'd like to go to one interesting thing and then take your questions or comments, because you're out on the front lines. So I'm always interested in what you have to say. I don't know if y'all are doing this in Arkansas, but in Tennessee, we have begun to, we've launched an initiative called, based on the ACEs study, which was a large study conducted by Kaiser Permanente and the Centers for Disease Control. They did a little questionnaire with 10 adverse events in childhood, such as abuse, death of a parent, alcoholic parents, some things like that, to 17,000 of their HMO members. And they correlated those things against the illnesses and diseases, particularly chronic diseases of middle age, and discovered that first of all, those adverse events are quite common. 40% of their patients had experienced at least 2 of them. But the second thing they found was a huge and statistically significant correlation between the score on this ACEs questionnaire, which was just an add-up of these events, and chronic illness. All of the chronic illnesses that are breaking the bank here now, heart disease, diabetes, obesity. Now, the methods of this study were nothing hugely impressive, but the results were so robust across every illness that was studied that they have launched, and we're doing it here in Tennessee, an effort to prevent these events, and also an effort to get physicians and other agencies to screen for these things when we do intakes with clients, so that if they've experienced these high levels, we can pretty much assume that they are experiencing high levels of stress, and some of these new interventions may be helpful. Well, I want to stop so you can ask some questions. We've got about 9 minutes left.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Conzorm. If you have any questions, be sure to kind of type those in. We do have one for you. In Arkansas, a lot of, I'm kind of rephrasing this question a little bit, but the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So, you know, with foster families, the idea of to reunify families together, but what's happening here is that oftentimes siblings are separated, or they're not settled with grandma or grandpa. It's with a foster family, or they try to do that. So any feedback, suggestions for Arkansas on how we can maybe help with that problem we're seeing in our state?
Boy, that's a problem in every state. It was a problem back when I was in child welfare practice. I think the first thing, and we all know this, is that to help the child, you have to help the family. But maybe particularly when we hear that awful phrase, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, is to remember that we all come into life with humongous genetic potential. But what gets developed depends upon the environment we experience, the parenting and the loving and even protective neighbors and enriched communities. And we can't just accept that it's inevitable, because somewhere walking around, I think of this when I see big crowds of kids, you know, there are potential Mozarts there. There are potential Einsteins. But if they don't receive particularly nurturing and love to help their brains develop, they'll never realize that potential. So maybe the focus ought to be less on genetics and more on epigenetics and resources and other kinds of ways to interact with genetic potential, and in particular with children who've been traumatized. Because the earlier we get after that, more successful we can be. And there are cases of success.
Thanks. We got another question. So regarding the role of resilience, where does it come into play with a person's physiological stress response?
Well, first of all, there is a part of resilience that is genetic. So if you've got the long allele, for instance, of the serotonin receptor gene, then you've got lots of nice calming serotonin in your hippocampus, so you don't overreact. If you've got a low reactive temperament, you'll have a much easier way a much easier time handling stress than other people. And as I said, there are a lot of other genes. I mean, you can look around and see that people respond differently to stress based on their genes. But much of what we call genetic is actually epigenetic. So I could be born very reactive in my temperament, but if I get the right parenting, soothing and nurturing and loving, then I have the best shot at becoming a little less reactive and being able physiologically to handle those spurts of hormones more effectively. So genes play a role, but probably epigenetics are more important, and that's just early experiences.
Okay, thanks.
Did that answer the question? Did that answer?
Yeah, and you know, for all those of you who, if a question comes to mind later, please be sure to email me, and I can pass it along to our speaker. We've got another one, and I'm going to forward the slide to our CU code just in the interest of time. Okay, I'm just kind of reading the question right now. Okay, all the research on the effects of stress on our physical body is one of the reasons I'm very encouraged with the biofeedback and neurofeedback therapies. I think that's just kind of a comment more than a question, but.
Oh yeah, but to me it's even more exciting that you don't even have to get quite that fancy. Research shows, for instance, that deep belly breathing cannot be happening at the same time you've got high levels of adrenaline spurting. If you practice deep breathing when you're feeling tense, you can lower all of those stress hormones and experience a relief. I mean, neurofeedback is great, but you can also do some of this stuff, you know, sitting in at a red light in your car. Deep breathing, yoga, meditation, even exercise have been shown to reduce levels of stress hormones and the resulting disease.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to forward it to our CU code. So if you're with us and if you want a CU, the code is there. Just be sure to email me and tell me your first and last name. That's always helpful. And if you're watching as a group, just let me know who the person was that signed in. I'll be sure to get that to you. Dr. Combs-Orme, would it be okay if we made this presentation as a handout for those who are on today?
Oh, sure. Yes, I'd like that.
Okay, that's usually a common question. Several folks have asked that, so great. I'll make that available after the webinar today. So we can stick around for another minute or so if you have any last-minute questions.
And I'd like to emphasize, if you're in an agency that could use this kind of information, my time is paid for this kind of stuff. So I love to come and do training and that kind of stuff if you think it would be useful. So, and that again is thanks to the Early Child Institute in Memphis.
One other question here. Can epigenetic changes, can they occur at any age?
Yes, I should have mentioned that. They can. Obviously, it's easier early in life when the brain is still developing. But yes, it can happen at any time. They've verified, for instance, that learning to juggle changes the brains of people in their 80s. So yeah, we can make these kinds of changes because genes get expressed based on input. So to me, that's the exciting thing. It's the reason it's so short, the reason we should understand this. Thank you for that question.
And one more here. What are some interventions that you use? I guess this is regards to maybe with children.
We are testing a deep breathing intervention right now with stressed out preschoolers. And what we seem to be finding is that the more highly stressed out kids may benefit the most from deep breathing. It's simple. 4- and 5-year-olds can learn how to do it. And I'm really excited about that because it doesn't have to involve the parents. You know, so many kids who need to help their parents won't come in. So we like that we could do this at school and maybe help children who are under high stress.
Okay, last call for any questions. We'll be on for another 20 to 30 seconds and we'll sign off. So any last questions, just type those in.
Thank you all so much. It's always fun to talk to Chad and to share my passion with people.
Well, we appreciate you being neighborly and helping Arkansas out today. So.
No problem. I love Arkansas.
Yeah. Okay, folks, we're going to go ahead and sign off. So again, just if you'd like to see you, there's a code up on the screen, and email that to me. And I'll send a copy of the presentation out to everybody. And if you think of a question later today or next week, just send me an email and I'll pass it along to our presenter. And you all have a great rest of the week.